Hello, everyone. Great to see you here today for the first of our BEI Knowledge Bursts. These are short presentations meant to really deliver some operational experience and operational instructions for educational items of every type. And we'll begin here today with a BEI Knowledge Burst on the topic that really is just to gain some comfort with the process and the concept of competency-based advancement. My name is Erik Alexander. I'm Executive Director of the BEI. I'll give just a bit of background as we think about this topic of competency-based advancement. Medical learners of all types progress through their training to assume greater clinical responsibility. And of course, the goal is to ensure that every learner is competent to deliver high-quality care as an independent practitioner at the end of that training. But historically, the reality is that the learner progresses and the learner progress has been defined more so by time, that we have certain length of courses or of clerkships or of residencies, much more so than determined by competency itself. But that is really changing over the last 10 years. In fact, over the last decade or more, the emphasis has moved both on a UME or undergraduate medical education level, as well as a GME level, the graduate medical world, towards this idea that competency is the defining attribute. And I would say as of 2022, we are increasingly using a competency-based assessment system quite frequently. And I would argue that the system in the world and the nation is moving towards embracing a competency-based advancement process as well. The assessment system, of course, is just individual feedback and individual assessment of abilities. Advancement would be when you're ready to move on to a different level, whether that means moving from a clerkship student to a sub-intern, a sub-intern to an intern, or an intern to a resident. You would do that when you're ready and not based on a certain amount of time. So let's talk a little bit about the forms of competency-based advancement that are commonly used in medical education, why they are important. And I'm really going to focus on two because they are the ones most actively in front of both the UME and the GME world at the present time here in the United States. Now, the question, of course, comes up why, and there are many answers as to why we should be pursuing a competency-based medical advancement dogma. But I always like this intriguing paper as well, which was now a decade old in the Annals of Internal Medicine, where Young and colleagues looked at the impact of the changeover, so to speak, every July as it related to new interns arriving in a medical center. And this was the idea, of course, that they were shedding a little bit of light that perhaps it wasn't that competency that was driving people's ability, trainees' ability to take on the next step, but rather it was simply time. And that was not a good marker. And what they showed in a kind of gradual way here without proof of exact concept is that perhaps there were increases in adverse effects on patient care July 1st when a new set of interns would arise. All the more reason to focus on competency and to ensure everyone who starts whatever level of training is ready to do so. So I'm really going to focus on two of what could be many different competency-based systems, but they're the ones commonly in front of us, and I'd like to raise awareness. One is called the Milestones, that is really put forth and created by the ACGME, the governing body for graduate medical education. And the separate will be called Entrustable Professional Activities, EPAs, created by the AAMC, which really oversees undergraduate medical education. They're similar. One on the left, the Milestones, more descriptors of physicians, as you're going to see, and on the right, the EPAs, more descriptors of work. You see here the descriptors of physicians kind of grounded in those core competencies of medical knowledge, patient care, professionalism that GME training programs will hold as kind of their 6 competencies that every trainee has to meet. Whereas the UME world will think of EPAs a little bit more as descriptors of medical or clinical work, like gathering a history or physical exam, prioritizing a differential diagnosis, obtaining informed consent, etc. So they are very much related. But they're a little bit different. And when I begin to talk about competency systems, we're going to talk about their kind of creation and their framework, but we're also going to have an emphasis on their application because they are created to be a little bit different based on how they're applied in those settings. And I think you'll see what I mean here moving forward. So first, a little bit of background on the EPAs. Of course, the idea is embedded in the words that we use trust as the guiding decision point to assess kind of doctoring or real clinical world activities as it applies to patient care. And the idea here is that, is a graduating medical student ready for day number 1 of their internship? And what does it mean to be ready for day number 1? And are there multiple pieces and facets that may constitute readiness? Ultimately, what we're after is the trainee competent. Now, you can begin to see there's a logic to this, but also that each of these questions has a little bit of a breadth around how you might answer it. And in fact, some of us might each answer it a little bit different than the other. But there is kind of a grounding effect to this, especially if you're in clinical medicine yourself. I show you here the standard pediatric developmental chart that many of us would be familiar with in medicine, the Denver Developmental Screening Scale or Screening Test. The idea here, I think, that does resonate with many people as you think about competency-based advancement is that in pediatrics, we think about this all the time. From left to right here on the x-axis, this would be a child or an infant's age from months up to 1 year, and then from many years moving forward up to age 6. And you can begin to see, based on population assessment, that we have many different personal or social attributes that we would expect to progress over the course of infant's development, fine motor traits, language, gross motor traits, etc. It's the same general idea. So what is an EPA? Well, it's a unit, again, of professional practice that can be entrusted to a trainee as soon as he or she has demonstrated the necessary competence to execute the activity unsupervised. It's a unit of work, and it really is based, again, on trust that the senior person has in the trainee who's trying to gain that skill. So trust is a loaded always term a little bit. The idea, as I mentioned, is to move forward. We acknowledge or we assume that a trainee has passed some sort of threshold of trust that allows, therefore, for decreased supervision or, conversely, increased independence. We trust them with more responsibility, and in trusting, we assume they are generally accurate, professional, and responsible. The key, of course, is to remember that trust is a little bit of a vague term, and some of us are more trusting and some of us are less trusting, and there would lie in the differences. But I told you that a lot here is not just how the actual framework for the competency-based tool is created, but a lot of it is also understanding the basic application. And EPAs were really created more for the undergraduate medical education world, the medical student world. And you can understand kind of why, because we use EPAs really as an assessment tool. And then we do use it for basic competency, but that is to move to the next level. The assessment tool would go something like this. For any of those given clinical skills, like does the student gather a medical history well? You can see a ranking here from 1 to 5. Well, a student may be able to observe one, but not really execute one, even with direct supervision. Or number 2, they can actually execute a medical history with some direct and proactive supervision from a supervisor. Or number 3, we let them actually go independently. They can do okay, but there's some reactive supervision when they either need it or when the patient seems to be going a bit tangential, when there's kind of a trigger. Then there's kind of levels 4 and 5. The trainee can actually do and execute a full medical history, perhaps with supervision only at a distance or after the fact for some feedback, or they're really able to do it with the help only of a junior colleague. Well, if you're going to use it as an assessment tool, this would be a good way to give kind of consistent and reproducible feedback to the trainee. And you might use it as a competency tool to understand if they passed a certain point in their clerkship or a different point in their 4-year curriculum. You might be able to say, well, hey, if you've hit level 4 or 5 in the above assessment metric, that's considered competent and you're entrusted to move forward to the next level. So when we talk about EPAs, entrustable professional activities, they've really been more in this yellow circle, primarily developed and then implemented as expectations for medical school graduates before they enter internship. But you can apply them more broadly. We just haven't seen that applicability yet as greatly defined. You can see that, of course, there would be different EPAs for more senior physicians or for people in specialties versus primary care. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but this was the feeling of what would be the 13 different EPAs defined by the AAMC to be a day one resident. And you can see, again, the clinical skills here that were desired, and to which many schools currently throughout the US and Canada actually are using at the current time. So let's switch, though, to the other commonly used competency-based advancement tool or framework, which will be referred to often as the milestones. These are a little bit descriptors of physicians, and this is the framework that has been developed by the ACGME, which is the oversight body for graduate medical education for interns, residents, and fellows. And so they're going to be somewhat similar, but milestones are really thought more a little bit in contrast as a significant point in development, a descriptor, if you will, not of a work or activity, but as a point on a continuum. And they enable the learner and the program to determine trajectories. And you're going to begin to see there, it's not just as much the framework, but also how are these competency-based advancement models being applied. So they describe a learning trajectory within a competency that takes a resident or fellow from novice in a specialty or a subspecialty to proficient. That's the idea. Let's take a look at an example of a milestone. You'll begin to see up on the top here how we think about milestones, how they're generally used more in the GME framework, which is kind of this level 1 to level 5, left to right on the top of the screen. The idea that level 1 would be a novice resident or fellow, and level 5 would be exceeding their peers. When you begin then to apply it to one of the core competencies, so in the bottom graph, you see the competency being patient care, the subcompetency being urgent and emergent medical conditions, you begin to see then how you can define these levels 1 through 5 with descriptors that are on a continuum. Level 1 being that the intern recognizes urgent and emergent medical conditions, initiating protocols, and knows the code status. We'd expect that of a GME first day trainee, but very different from, let's say, level 4 here, coordinates the initial assessment and management and of the emergent condition and the interprofessional care team that is dealing with it, or considers patient and family wishes in the moment to modify the code status. That's a very different descriptor, but there's a clear growth trajectory. And there are ways that they often will say, here's how we can assess whether that GME-based trainee, that resident, that intern, that fellow has hit that behavior, looking at the 6 core competencies that the ACGME puts forth: patient care, medical knowledge, professionalism, interpersonal and communication skills, practice-based learning, and systems-based practice. There are many ways you can assess then these descriptors. But again, I think we really embody the idea of competency-based frameworks and advancement really also in line with how they are used. What is the application? And what's a little different when we think about the ACGME-based framework of milestones is they're really not there so much for assessment and then assessment of competency-based next steps, but rather there's a lot of emphasis in the GME world that these provide more of a descriptive roadmap for a trainee's education and training. They allow them to see the full continuum of what is likely to occur in their educational growth. And it's likely to be a mirror back as to here is where you are at now. Here would be your next logical step. It's a bit more of a transparency as opposed to a true assessment as though you're in school, like medical school. And I think that's the key here that I want to emphasize. It's not as though these two different competency-based frameworks are all that different, but I think the mindset of how they are applied somewhat defines then how they're framed and how they're used. So I'll finish here with really just 2 last slides that I invite you to learn a lot more on this topic. And I really did just a cursory introduction to really what are the 2 commonly used competency-based frameworks for advancement in medical education. There are many others, but to help dig into the next level, we here in the BEI have put together this BEI bundle, which is really going to be a 2-page document, but it links in many different opportunities for continued reading and continued learning. For example, if you'd like to see a basic short video on the topic, we encourage you to click on the hyperlink in number 1. You can move on then to number 2, understanding kind of the basic principles of why competency-based medical advancement and medical education was formulated. We walk you through different items here, kind of 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 to grow that skill set. And then, of course, welcome you to provide to us any other ideas where you think we could make this a stronger introduction to anyone interested in growing their skills. With that, I thank you very much today for joining us for this Knowledge Burst. I welcome you to take advantage of other Knowledge Bursts here up and coming, and reach out to the BEI at any time for any of our resources. Thank you very much.